Welcome to Contrarian Humanitarian, your blog and podcast for all things international development, analyzing global injustices and building solutions for a better world. Hello. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Contrarian Humanitarian. I am your host, Erin Edmiston, and I am joined by my amazing producer and also co-host for today, Mikey Pogoloff.
Hey, how y'all doing? Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, so today is episode 5, the CIA, Humanitarianism and Labor Movements, a continuation from last week's episode. If you haven't checked it out, be sure to check it out. This is part 2, so we're going to be talking about free speech, IWWs, which is Industrial Workers of the World, AFL-CIO, which stands for American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, the Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International. Dun, dun, dun. Where are you going to get all this information in one place? But Contrarian Humanitarian. So thank you so much for joining us. So, sorry, I'm getting some notifications. You know, I told my computer not to notify me. So we are excited to share this amazing work by our two guests that we have on today. We have our returning champion, Eric Thomas Chester, amazing archival research historian, former economics professor, and obviously author of numerous books. 2 of those we'll be talking about today. And then also Dan Kovalik, another returning champion from our second episode, will join us in the latter half of the show to continue our conversation of labor rights and also add information about Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. So stay tuned for that. So Mikey, do you want to talk a little bit about why we're co-hosting today?
Sure. As y'all know, Erin is our primary host and I am the producer. But sometimes I'll sit in to help out with hosting the show. And I think one of the reasons for that is we have very complementary sort of knowledge sets when it comes to the information we're dealing with. Erin's is much more on the ground, hands-on, dealing with refugee resettlement, has done a lot more traveling than me. And my background is, I know a little bit more about history. Certainly not a historian or anything like that, but when we get into a subject like today where we're covering over a century of events, including labor history and all these different things, sometimes I can help Erin with a little context, historical context here and there that she may not know, and our viewers too. But we're going to try and do a good job today of asking Eric and Dan, our guests, to explain anything that our guests might not know. So that kind of works well with Erin. She's always good at stopping people and being like, hey, can you explain this or that? So yeah, that's why I'm here today.
Yes. So we're complimenting each other. We're going to help each other out on this podcast. But obviously Eric and Dan will be, the primary people that are going to be talking and teaching us about all the things we have on the agenda for today. So we're going to try to keep this intro short so Eric can jump on soon. But I just want to say that we're so pumped to bring this conversation to y'all, and me and Mikey are excited to be dual hosts because really what Mikey was just saying sort of is the whole kind of theme of Contrarian Humanitarian, trying to bring political perspective to humanitarians, people in international development that might not be in political spaces or understand the political underpinnings of what we do. And also vice versa, noticing that the left, at least in the United States, lacks often an international perspective. So also trying to bring to the U.S. left a more international perspective with all of our guests and humanitarian experience and understanding. So we're really excited about this show. We hope you stay tuned for the entire show. Learn a lot. Please ask questions in the chat box and we'll get to them towards the end. And yeah, so just a little bit about the show for today. Eric will come on and we're going to get into the Wobblies. Who are the Wobblies? I didn't even know until a month ago, so Eric will explain. So yes, we're going to talk about labor movements. And then, as I said, Dan will come in the latter half of the show. And then, continue to stay on because eventually, Dan has to leave at 4 o'clock Eastern time. And towards the end of the show, also, we'll talk with Eric about free speech, which is another one of his more recent books. We're not going to spend a ton of time talking about free speech today because we want to plug, again, the Red Library podcast, where Eric has about a 2-hour interview with Red Library Pod, where he goes into his book, Free Speech. Free Speech and Dissent. So please check, yes, thank you. Free Speech and the Suppression of, I knew that wasn't right. Free Speech and the Suppression of Dissent during World War I. So again, for a robust conversation, please see Red Library Podcast, shout them out. And we'll be getting into Eric's other recent work. Thank you. The Wobblies in their heyday, the rise and destruction of the industrial workers of the world during World War I era. And we're also going to be touching on his anthology. Y'all, this is one of a kind. He has done some amazing, got some amazing, archival or documents from the archive that I'll let him share that story. This is really a one-of-a-kind piece, so be sure to check this out as well. Years for Industrial Freedom, the industrial workers of the world from the inside. So that's very interesting. So yeah, that is our podcast for today. Please be sure to subscribe and follow us on all of our social media. We're all over the place: Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and we also have audio version only podcast on SoundCloud and Spotify. But if you want all things Contrarian Humanitarian, there is a one-stop shop, and that is contrarianhumanitarian.org, where you can listen to our audio series, our live podcast, and our blog. So we appreciate everybody so far that's been liking, subscribing us, and supporting us, and we hope to have your continued support. So,
yeah, I think we got Eric in the waiting room. We're ready to go. Also,
yes.
Don't forget Dan is going to be in the second half, and we're going to move from throughout the IWW, the Wobblies, into the AFL history, and then after they merge with the AFL, become the AFL-CIO, some of their CIA contacts, and hopefully we'll have time to get into a little bit of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International as well to sort of round out, bookend our humanitarian and labor movement discussion here, this 2-part series. All right, let's go ahead and bring in Eric. Hello.
Here I am.
Hi, Eric.
Good to see you.
Welcome. Good to see
Good
you
to see you
again. Thanks so much for coming on again.
See if I can push this down a little bit.
Yeah.
There we go.
Perfect. All right. So we're having a little bit of a change today in our schedule. So thank you for being flexible. So let's go. So we'll talk about free speech towards the end, if that's still all right with you. So let's start into the Wobblies, your book about the Wobblies during the World War I era. As I said in the introduction, I had actually not heard of the Wobblies until I saw your book. I'm very new to union and labor movements conversation, and this is why I'm really excited to have you, to have read, your books and to have you on to explain the labor movement, because you actually have a quote that I really liked. I think it's in your anthology about, let me get it. But essentially saying that it's important to understand this history because in order to face our obstacles in building a movement, we have to understand the past. And I agree with that and think it's extremely critical. So I'm excited to learn and have you explain. So where would you like to start with Wobblies in their heyday to novice audience?
Okay, well, let me just start with that quote. The idea, what I was saying was not only that it was important to learn from history, but in order to do that, it has to be accurate history. So all too often, unfortunately, on both sides, people tend to fudge what they find, and therefore it renders it far less useful in trying to figure out the future if you don't have an accurate picture of the past. So I actually got some flack. I was a member of the IWW when I wrote that book. I got some flack from IWW members who said it was too critical. So, that's the history. Personally, I feel very positive about the IWW, but it wasn't perfect. It made mistakes. When I came across them, I put it down on paper. That's my job. That's what you should be doing. So that was the context of that quote. So let me just start with the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. One of the reasons I was interested, obviously, I'm a radical, so I was generally interested, but one of the reasons I was particularly interested is part of sort of dogma now in U.S. history is that radicals never really took root, that this country has always been sort of hostile to radicalism. And one of the things I found when I studied the IWW during World War I was that, quite on the contrary, they were amazingly successful. In the summer of 1917, they were organizing militant strikes, and they were growing rapidly. Workers, they didn't go out and look for workers. Workers came to them. They were, flooding them. So they got to be about 150,000 people, which was pretty good in itself, but also considering that they were still growing. So they would have been even larger had the government not moved in. So that was sort of part of what interested me. And then, of course, the flip side of that is, as you become successful, and they were, the government starts taking notice. And, first they could say, oh, well, they're just a bunch of, out there types. But all of a sudden, a lot of working class people, particularly in the West, were really listening to what they had to say, joining their unions, participating in demonstrations. It wasn't so easy to write them off. And they began to be seen as a threat. And as they were seen as a threat, the government, both at state and federal levels, started coming down on them. So and then of course the question is, how do you deal with that? Unfortunately, the WOPs did not do a very good job with it, and they wound up being really suppressed. So that was the kind of thing I wanted to look at, both the rise, that is, how it was that they could attract so many people, and then the fall, that is, as the government, they were on their radar, started taking actions against them. So that's sort of the overall sort of context of the book. And I think it does actually set new insights into the way the IWW was, because a lot of the historians in the past, coming from an academic tradition, just assumed that they were radicals and they were marginal, but they weren't. In fact, they weren't marginal. And the government didn't think, it wasn't that the government was overreacting. They understood fully well this was a real threat to their continued power, and particularly to continuing the war, which was very unpopular. And they responded accordingly. So that's the overall context. The IWW started in 1905. They had a big conference in Chicago where they drew most of a wide assortment of lefties showed up in Chicago, not just union people. And so the idea was to create an organizational structure, a union, where people of different radical persuasions could all work together, whether they were anarchists, socialists, just militants. They all came together on the idea of having industrial unions. Now, at the time, the American Federation of Labor was very much a craft union. So each craft would have its own union. Each skill would have its own union. So, for instance, in the railroad industry, there were 3 skilled unions, and they didn't get along particularly well. So if you were a fireman, you were in one union. If you were a conductor, that kind of thing. So the IWW said, no, what we need is industrial unions. Everybody who works in a certain industry joins that union. But they actually had a broader idea than that. The IWW would be a federation of industrial unions. So when one union went out on strike, other unions would help them. And that was the one big union idea. It was their favorite slogan, OBU, one big union. So it was a totally different conception than the AFL's of what a union should be like. And then, of course, they were radicals in addition, so they saw this as a first step towards building a movement to fundamentally change society, also very different than the AFL. So it was just a totally different idea of what it meant to be a union. And needless to say, the AFL hated them. The leadership of the AFL hated them. And vice versa. The Lobs didn't think too highly of them either. So anyway, that's sort of the beginning of where it came about. And it's interesting, when it started, the biggest section of the newly formed IWW was the Western Federation of Miners, which had at one time been part of the AFL, then left, helped to form the IWW. Then a few years later, the leadership changed or shifted, and they moved out of the IWW and back into the AFL. So, but in the process, a lot of the miners who had joined the IWW stayed, and a lot of the leadership of the IWW came out of the Western Federation of Miners. I should say the mining industry in the West was twofold. You had what was called hard rock industries, which like copper, where you dug way, way down in the ground, thousands of feet underground, and you blasted rock to get the ore you were looking for. And then there was coal, which was a different kind of industry and required a lot less capital than hard rock mining. The Western Federation of Miners and the WOBs came out of the hard rock mining, the really deep, way down mines, most of which were producing copper. So it's interesting that the copper miners from the start were a really critical part of what was going on. And that was very dangerous work, as you can imagine. It wasn't that poorly paid by the perspective of the time, but it was very dangerous, very tough. And there was a lot of camaraderie. These were big mines. They're often, in Butte, Montana, which was the biggest copper mining center, there were 10,000 copper miners. That's a lot of copper miners. And even in a smaller one like Bisbee, there was 5,000 copper miners. So it wasn't exactly a factory, but it wasn't really far from it either. And the miners lived in company towns, basically. That's what you did in a copper mining town, is you produced copper. There wasn't much else. There were bars and stuff to go with for the miners, but that's it. So everything was focused on that one thing, and that helped make it easier to organize because everybody was, they shared a common past. So that when I was doing research on this book, I thought a particularly interesting strike happened in Bisbee. It's a small town near the Arizona border, copper mining. And the Western Federation of Miners had tried to organize there, got nowhere. And in the spring of 1917, the WOBs decided to make that a priority, organizing copper miners. And they started organizing in Bisbee. And again, the miners just flocked because the Western Federation of Miners wasn't doing anything. It was wartime. Their leadership was tied into the government and was trying to promote the war. The mines were working 24 hours a day. I mean, you couldn't produce enough copper because copper is essential for all kinds of munitions. So, whatever you produced, the American government or British government immediately bought it. And in this situation, which should have been ideal for a union, Western Federation of Miners was, cozying up to the government. So the miners just flocked to the IWW, and there were about 5,000 miners in the Bisbee area. And they went out on strike. And this is another interesting thing about the IWW. For those people who know a little bit about it, it has sort of a reputation of being a loosey-goosey kind of thing. Everybody does their own thing. But the reality was, when they went out on strike, it was very disciplined. And so the miners were told, don't get into fights with the company guards. Don't bring your gun. This is the West, so everybody had a gun. But don't bring it to the picket line. And Yeah, so it was a very disciplined kind of picket line, and was very effective. The IWW pulled out virtually everybody who worked in the mines. They had big rallies, 1,000 people or so, virtually every day. I've been to Bisbee, so it's hard for me to even envision this. This place is deserted now, desolate. But at the time, they would have rallies of 1,000 people, and they would give speeches about sort of ABCs of Marxism and stuff like that. And the miners would cheer, and and of course they talked about the strike and how they were going to win it. The strike was a lot about safety. I said the mines were very unsafe, so a lot of the demands had to do with safety. Needless to say, the company absolutely refused to negotiate with them. Wouldn't even talk with them. Forget reach an agreement. They wouldn't even talk with them. And this went on for about 2 weeks, and then at the end of the 2 weeks, the mining companies organized a vigilante squad of about 2,000 people armed with machine guns, started rounding up the miners, and shipped them off into the desert in packed cattle cars. It's amazing a lot of people didn't die. This was in July. You can imagine what Arizona's like in July.
Right. Sorry. Again, who was responsible for rounding up these miners?
Well, theoretically, they were sheriff's deputies, very theoretically, but the machine guns came from the corporations, the mining corporations. This wasn't like an official thing. It was like a vigilante action. And yeah, so you can imagine what the cattle cars were like. Temperature must have been well over 100, and they were packed together in these cattle cars. There was one bucket of water for each car, and sometimes the bucket of water where you couldn't drink it. Water was spoiled. It was amazing that actually more people didn't die. They think maybe 2 people died out of nearly 1,200. These were very tough people, right? And they were miners. They were used to really harsh conditions, but this was, way above. Anyway, they were dumped out into the desert and left. And after about a day, the soldiers came from the U.S. Army, took them to an Army base, and they tried to get back into Bisbee. The vigilantes wouldn't let you get off the train. They interrogated everybody who came in off the train. If you didn't have a good reason to be in Bisbee, you went back on the train. So it was like, I was thinking like, this is what corporate fascism would really look like. It happened for several months in Bisbee. Completely illegal, of course, unconstitutional, but it happened. And the strike was broken. So that's the story of the Bisbee miners. So as I did the research on it, I was really impressed by the way the miners could carry on the strike, could maintain discipline. The mining companies had goons. They would push people around, try and get them into fights that wouldn't do it because they were on tight discipline. Yeah, it's just a very impressive strike, and unfortunately, it lost. The Bisbee strike is particularly interesting too because what happened is after a while the miners left the Army base and started going all around the West looking for work, and there was plenty of work at the time. And that made all the state governments really nervous because they started saying, look, all you've done is you moved the wobbly menace from Bisbee to all around the West. So they petitioned the president, Woodrow Wilson, and they said, look, this is beyond the state level, and the federal government has to move in. And it was that really pushed Wilson into deciding that he was going to crush the IWW. There'd been pressure building up before, but the Bisbee strike and then these miners being spread out, you're talking about 1,200 people, really convinced him that something had to be done. And from that point on, the federal government went after the IWW with every measure they could think of. Mass trials, their offices were raided and stuff was thrown around, and they couldn't go get through, their newspaper couldn't get through the mail. To me, one of the toppers was at one point in San Francisco, two people who were friendly to the IWW, but weren't really WABs. They were just, friendly. And they were working on the IWW General Defense Committee, raising money for lawyers to defend themselves in these 3 mass trials. And they were arrested under the Espionage Act for obstructing the war effort. One of them copped out. Her family was wealthy, and she was, given a slap on the wrist. But the other one wound up in jail with the WABs, and very harsh conditions. He went insane. He had to be taken off to a mental institution. So they were playing for keeps. The federal government was absolutely intent on crushing the IWW. So I think that's another thing you think about when you try and learn the lessons of history, is that if you become effective, and they were, then you have to expect that the level of repression will tend to go up, and you better be ready for it. Unfortunately, the WABs were not really ready for it. They didn't handle it very well. They sort of hoped that it would go away. Maybe they could get good lawyers, et cetera. But it didn't go away, and the court system was rigged against them. So something to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm kind of interested. We didn't get a chance, just to be totally upfront, to go through all this material in the last week. It's just way too much. But we've been delving into it a little, and I think one of the things you found most interesting, one of the things I find interesting, is the internal disputes within the IWW over strategy, and that they echo a lot of the disputes that people have today in the greater organizing space of the left, or just in general organizing, I suppose. Can you speak to some of those? Can you go through some of the disagreements that were had?
Okay. Well, partially this is where the anthology comes in. Although I also talk about it in the Wobblies in their heyday. Let me just tell you where the anthology came from, because it's an interesting story itself. So there was one big mass trial. There were 3 mass trials altogether, but there was one that was most important in Chicago, where the leaders of the IWW were tried. And it lasted for 5 months. Imagine that. There were dozens of witnesses, and almost all of them got convicted and got sentences between 5 and 20 years. So the transcript was huge, something like 15,000 pages. But they took it. They raised the money because they wanted to appeal it to the circuit court. The Supreme Court refused to hear it. Well, so in this court trial, each of the defendants had a dossier, because they had been raiding the IWW offices repeatedly throughout the fall of 1917. So they had literally tons of documents, tons. And there was a whole team of FBI agents called the Bureau of Intelligence then, who went through these documents, picking out what would be useful into that dossier. And that was then part of the record. Well, when the Supreme Court refused to hear it, apparently a judge decided that they would just remove all those dossiers from the transcript. And I found the one remaining transcript. It's like, eureka. I found it. So that's really the basis of that anthology. And of course, in that transcript, his correspondence was rank and file, but also between IWW leaders. And so they talk about their differences and what's going on. So the biggest difference they had was how to deal with the war. As it became clear that the U.S. would enter World War I, they had to decide what to do. Now, everybody knew that you were taking a risk if you continued to oppose the war. But on the other hand, the IWW had a history of opposing militarism, and in fact had passed a resolution saying that if the U.S. ended the war and there was a draft, they would try and organize a general strike. But so they had that history. On the other hand, the IWW leadership felt like if they went ahead and acted on it, they would immediately be thrown in jail. So they started fudging. And that was really the essence of the debate. Almost nobody supported the war. That was a very, very small number. Almost all the activists and leaders of the IWW opposed the war. It's a very unpopular war. But the question was, how outspoken should you be? And the rank and file in particular were more militant than the leaders, which I thought was interesting. even in the IWW, let alone a traditional AFL union where you expect that. But in this critical moment when, things were really tense, it was really the rank and file who pushed and said, we're opposed to the war. We want you to start organizing against the war, demonstrations, whatever, not just them. They issued sort of vaguely anti-war statements, but, I wanted them really, and of course there were other groups that were opposed to the war as well. So to be part of a broader militant anti-war movement. And that really split the IWW. So you had most of the leadership saying, no, let's just focus on our workplace issues, downplay any opposition to the war. And then there were rank and file and a few people in the leadership. Frank Little was one of them, who was saying, look, it's our principle, right? We just said what we're going to do. You can't just, because now it's, that doesn't work. And so there was it was a really heated debate, but basically the leadership won. They never did actually effectively organize against the war. Whatever organizing happened at the grassroots, that's where it happened. And so the letters between Frank Little and Big Bill Haywood, the Secretary Treasurer of the IWW, are in the anthology. It shows you, you get a real feel for what that debate was. And you have to remember these two people were very, very close. They'd worked together for 15, 20 years in very tough circumstances. And yet this issue really tore them apart. Little was saying to Haywood, you're not keeping our principles. Our principles oppose the war. Yeah, we know it's going to be tough, but that's what we have to do. So that's a good example of the kind of internal debates they had. And of course, needless to say, this didn't get played out in their newspaper. The newspapers sort of had the fudgy position. They didn't have like pro and con kind of things, no. So you have to dig. And I find that just generally to be the case. If you want to find out what really happens, you got to dig, because it's always the case. There's a lot more happening beneath the surface than is on top of the surface.
So speaking of Frank Little, and speaking of what you mentioned earlier about when the level of resistance and the success of that resistance rises, the suppression rises as well. Can you touch on what happened to Frank Little?
Sure. So Frank Little was a very prominent figure in the IWW. He was a former miner, and he was the lead organizer in Arizona, organizing the Bisbee and other strikes. So he was very well respected. And he was sent to Butte. Butte is a complicated situation. They had an independent union that was both had IWW members who were in the leadership. It wasn't an IWW local. It also had left-wing Socialist Party people who were in the leadership. So it was complicated. And so he was sent there. Frank Little was sent there to help the strike. They were in the midst of a strike. And also to try and convince them to join the WAPs. And he made some speeches against the war, because I was just saying about he was committed to maintaining that militant anti-war position, even though it was very dangerous. And on August 1st, 1917, a death squad paid by the mining corporations lynched him. He was murdered. And it was a huge blow to the IWW. That's a cartoon about it. So, they were used to quite a lot of corporate violence, but this was at a different level. When you start sending out death squads, you've moved beyond. It's not it's the kind of thing you expect in Central America. You don't expect in the United States, but it happened. And needless to say, nobody was ever prosecuted, even though the government clearly must have known who was involved. No one was ever prosecuted for it. So it was a huge blow. And, he became a martyr for the IWW. It's remembered by a lot of people. It was a very dangerous time. And after he was murdered, they pinned on a little note on his body with initials. And the initials were supposed to relate to other leaders of the Butte miners And so after that time, those Butte miners slept in different places, different nights. They had bodyguard, they had guards at night to try and protect them so this wouldn't happen again. The other thing about the Little's murder is that until then, the government had not intervened directly. But after Little was murdered, the U.S. Woodrow Wilson sent in federal troops to patrol the streets and, of course, to help break the strike. And they stayed there for years. Well after the war ended, there were federal troops patrolling the streets in Butte. They would beat up people who, the would see in Union people. And it was like undeclared martial law. It was the military occupation of Butte. Then that followed after Frank Little's murder, which I think was part of the idea from the mining corporation, was saying, look, either the federal government intervenes or we'll take care of it with our goons. Of course, for Wilson, there was a third alternative. He could have tried to actually protect the miners, prosecute the murderers, but that wasn't on the table. So instead, he sent in federal troops, and they beat up on strikers.
Yeah.
One thing you showed that cartoon that I was going to mention, but I think it's important to think about. The IWW made a big point of trying to create a counterculture. Songs, cartoons, newspapers. I mean, they just tried to create a counter. I mean, we live in a different age with the computer and all that, so it would be a different kind. But it's an important thing to keep in mind. They didn't sit around and say, "Oh well, the Chicago Tribune isn't covering us." No, they assumed that they wouldn't get good coverage in the mainstream media, and they tried to think of, their own ways. And so they had little songbooks. Joe Hill. People know about Joe Hill, right? Joe Hill was a rank and file WAB who was a songwriter, and he wrote for the songbook, and some of his songs became really famous. But it was I think a quite conscious decision to see, because they sort of viewed themselves as a prefigurative organization, as they were prefiguring a future society, and of course that future society would have a different culture. But you got to start doing it now, not just say, "Well, someone down the road." Right now you got to start doing it. And so that's about Joe Hill's execution. He was accused of killing somebody in a robbery in Salt Lake City. No one knows even now exactly what happened, but yeah, he was. It was interesting. He became the most famous Wobbly because he was a martyr. And he had these songs that were so popular. He was actually just a rank and file union member, which I think in a way is really positive that that it wasn't a top-down organization. There was plenty of room for people at the rank and file level to contribute, whether it be all kinds of different ways. His particular contribution was songs, and they're still songs, so it's pretty cool.
When you were just talking about the military staying in Butte, was it for a number of...
The military occupied Butte for, I think, like 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, and before that, you had mentioned the Espionage Act, and no one was prosecuted for Frank Little. Could you talk about the legality of, the espionage, I guess sort of a history of U.S. legality, a little bit in this time period. How were they able to, not that the United States government necessarily needs it to be legal to, have their troops stationed somewhere, but, could you explain, was that even legal at that time or was it not? How did that all work?
It wasn't legal, but they should not have been doing it. The troops in Butte are a complicated question. Troops have been sent in the past when there was disorder in various states, but generally they were immediately withdrawn at the end of that disorder in Butte. Well, first, the disorder didn't come from the strikers; it came from the corporations, and second, it went on for years. So, no, it wasn't legal, but then who was going to challenge it? The Espionage Act. So Woodrow Wilson understood that when he entered the war, it was very unpopular. They knew that. And they knew they were going to have to suppress dissent. That was going to have to be part of it. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. So they passed the Espionage Act, which is still in force. Much of it is still in force. And as the name tells you, it had mostly to do with spying. There were German spies in the United States. But part of it, a certain section of it, had to do with dissent. So those who, quote, obstructed the war effort or the draft, and that was the terminology, obstruct, could face up to 20 years in prison, federal prison. Big Bill Haywood and some of the other WAPs were given 20-year sentences. They didn't serve 20 years, but they were given 20-year sentences. So, and the government interpreted, the Justice Department interpreted obstruct in the broadest kind of way, so that we're actually getting into free speech here. But Eugene Debs, we'll talk about later, gave a speech in which he referred to U.S. troops as cannon fodder. That was sufficient basis to be convicted under the Espionage Act. He could have been sentenced to 20 years. He only got 10 and served 2.5. So it gives you an idea. The courts, overwhelmingly approved this kind of blatant violation of the First Amendment. Very few judges stood up to the government, and they're, they would say, if you speak out against a war, you're demoralizing the populace. That encourages people not to enlist in the military. Thus, you're obstructing the war effort. That was that kind of argument. That's the kind they made. And under that basis, forget free speech. It's down the toilet, because almost anything can be interpreted that way. If you can stretch it so that anything that might possibly demoralize the population, that is, make them less supportive of the war, is obstructing the war effort, well, free speech is just gone. That's it. So that's what happened. That was the Espionage Act. And that particular section of the Espionage Act was only for wartime. So that no longer holds. But there are other sections still go on. And say, unfortunately, even the liberal judges on the Supreme Court upheld the Espionage Act. They just tried to get the government to be a little less expansive in its definition. But nobody, at least in the court system, said, you've got a perfect right to oppose the war under the First Amendment. And, it's not like the government didn't have plenty of propaganda to counter it. So, that's what free speech means. I can't think of, I think one judge in Montana, actually. But other than that, I can't think of any judges who actually made a free speech argument. It was all just sort of, how do you tone it down, limit the arbitrariness of it.
Well, yeah. I guess we'll get, or do you want to have a question? I was going to say,
I was just going to say, in terms of today, this is what they used to prosecute Snowden with, Edward Snowden, correct? And a number of other people. So it is definitely still relevant today. But I think with the time we have left, maybe getting back to the sort of parallel development of the IWW with the AFL, just sort of recapping some of what you said about that the IWW was generally sort of more radical, that it was seen as sort of a riff-raff organization of disorganization and hobos and these kinds of fringe people on society. But what you reveal is that there's a lot more to it than that. They actually had a pretty high level of organization. That's one of the reasons you saw a lot of suppression. But meanwhile, the AFL is developing, starting in the late 1800s under Samuel Gompers, I believe, right?
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the differences between the AFL and the IWW, why they had, beef over organizing strategies, and what sort of happened over time as the AFL gained prominence and power?
Right. Well, so as explained, the AFL was very much a craft union. There were a few industrial unions, but most of them were craft unions. So they were very narrowly structured, and they were aimed at the skilled workers. I mean, we can really see this now, with so many people at the bottom delivering hamburgers and stuff like that. Those are the kind of people the AFL would have never even considered organizing. Forget it, yeah. So they aimed at the skilled workers by and large, and there are a few exceptions, but they aimed at the skilled workers, and also it was very top down. They tried to avoid militant strikes. They sometimes got sucked into them, but they tried to avoid them. They tried to, as much as possible, work out compromises with the employers. I mean, often the employers weren't interested, so they were forced into strikes, but that was their general attitude. They were tied into the political structure. They claimed to be, whatever benefits them kind of politics. But the fact is, they were tied into the Democratic Party. Gompers and Woodrow Wilson were tight. They're tied into the Democratic Party, and so that was just. And they were what we call business unions. Take care of business. I mean, narrowly focused kind of thing. The IWW is just an entirely different kettle of fish. Now, I should say that within the AFL, the Socialist Party had quite a few supporters who fought with Gompers all the time and fought for industrial unionism. Of course, were opposed to the Democratic Party. And the AFL wasn't a monolith, but that was, the majority of it, and certainly the leadership was like that. So the IWW was totally different. It was the grassroots. It encouraged grassroots activism. Locals had a lot of autonomy. The affiliated industrial unions had huge amount of autonomy, and they had tried to see themselves as part of a bigger movement for social change. And one of the things stories I like, and I don't think it's in my book actually. There was this woman, Maria Key, interesting woman. She was a doctor in Portland, Oregon, and an open lesbian. At the time, not easy to do, right? And she conducted abortions. Didn't make much of a secret about it. And that was, of course, completely illegal. And she was friends with the Portland IWW. They had her come and speak at various occasions. She liked them. They liked her. And that shows you that, this is a very different culture. But this kind of woman would be way, way out there at the time. And they've accepted her and worked with her. She was thrown in jail for opposing the war. So it gives you just a sense of how the AFL wouldn't have gotten within 500 miles of her. Not at all the kind of allies they wanted, but just a very different kind of way of viewing the world than the AFL had, or at least the AFL mainstream had. And even then, we're going to talk about the AFL-CIO and the CIA, but during World War I, the Gompers was involved with a covert operation in Mexico where they set up a, allegedly independent organization where the Mexican trade union movement and the American Federation of Labor would hold joint conferences. And of course, they always claimed this was totally independent of the government, but in fact, it was totally funded by the government. It was just another covert operation. So that kind of stuff goes way, way back. At least 100 years, the AFL has been playing footsie with the government and secret covert operations.
I find that very interesting, especially because generally World War I think you talked about this in the Red Library podcast, that era is understudied, under talked about. I didn't even touch on it at all in my sort of history of the world and conspiracy theories podcast. And one of the things I talk about is how this sort of security state rises out of the World War II era. But as I've come to find out, there is, it was definitely more bare bones before that because, the federal government of the United States took a long time to build up the sort of power and resources that it has now. But there was stuff going on before, also with the Bureau of Investigations, which was the predecessor to the FBI. They were cracking heads and doing dirty things 100 years ago, and helping to crack down on the dissent of both the Wobblies and the greater anti-war sentiment movement of that time, which was very large because nobody really wanted to partake in World War I. Do you know, like, was there an agency involved? Who was the go-between with the AFL in these early covert operations with Gompers?
No, Gompers and Wilson would meet.
That's crazy.
Yeah, no, Gompers and Wilson would. He was Wilson. The government, Wilson included, saw Gompers as an important ally. It was, and they trusted him at least to a large extent. And yeah, they would meet with him. I don't think there was any intermediary. They would meet with him.
Why did they see him as an ally? And can you maybe because today labor is so marginalized that even mainstream labor like AFL is not really seen as an ally to anybody in the federal government really. Why did they see him as ally? Was it because of he sort of walked this line of moderation between the more radical labor organizations, or was it another reason?
No, all of that, but you also got to remember one reason that the powers that be can dismiss the union officials these days. They don't have, they don't count for much. I mean, everybody can see that. The public sector unions are the one exception to that, but in the private sector, they've decimated the unions. Right now, during the First World War, there was this kind of groundswell of radical sentiment. There was full employment. So, you couldn't just fire people because, it was hard to find a replacement and they just find another job. There was no real threat. And also you got to think that the period before World War I, the rise of the progressive movement, not just, this is, I think, to me, the hardest thing to comprehend. Now, when we think about the way things play out in the U.S., the rural farm areas seem to be a bastion of conservatism, even weirder stuff than that. But then people just seem to take that as granted. Well, during the period leading up to World War I, farmers were actually quite militant and open to populist left-wing populist, not Trump populist, left-wing populist, the original populist stuff. So there was that kind of sort of public sentiment towards a leftish, outcome. And the government knew that. Woodrow Wilson knew that. And of course, they were all opposed to the war, whether they were farmers or workers. And, anti-war sentiment was very widespread, particularly in the West. So he needed some allies. And Gompers looked like a good bet. So I think that was the kind of context that it was in. And, Gompers would try and defend it, saying, well, look, we got certain things in return. For instance, the government nationalized the railroads. And when they nationalized the railroads, the guy who ran it, who was the Secretary of Treasury at the time, said that people could join a union. Well, they flocked into the union. These were AFL unions, not IWW unions. But they flocked into the unions, and there was a bitter strike after the war after the railroads were put back in the private sector. They did bust the union. There was a huge strike. So that was in a kind of way that Gompers would have justified it. Said, look, we're wheel and deal in here. And so I give Woodrow some of the things he needs: a peace, no strikes, a cover for suppressing the left, covert operations in Mexico, a lot of different things he was involved in. In return, though, the railroad unions get a chance to organize. To me, that's not much of a deal, but for Gompers, it was. So it was that kind of thing that was going on, but I think you're right. You can imagine now the head of the AFL-CIO going in and saying, well, in return for this, we want you to nationalize, I don't know, whatever. But no way, we're not going to do it. not going to happen. But it was a different time. Partially it was wartime, but more than that, there was a lot of support for leftish ideas, including national. I mean, the farmers hated the railroads, despised the railroads. That's why the populists organized against the railroad. So nationalizing the railroads had a lot of support, even out there in the rural areas. So, yeah, it's just a different kind of context. And yeah, Gompers was important. He was an important person.
Well, I think in about 5 or 10 more minutes, Dan is going to show up. Before that happens, you can just kind of leave it up to you what you want to say with these last few minutes, wrapping up on whether you want to talk about the IWW or maybe take the history of the AFL's covert activities a little further than we have so far. But it's up to you.
Just trying to think if there's something I wanted to say about the free speech stuff. So let me just say, just generally, I got involved in this because I had been researching like the International Rescue Committee, and I did a book about the U.S. invasion of the Dominican Republic. So this was a real change for me, and I got intrigued in it because this was right after 9/11, and it seemed to me that this civil liberties was going to come under real attack. It was coming under real attack. And so I sort of wanted to look at what happened during World War I with the opposition, because that was crunch time, you know? So that's how I got into it. And so in some ways, the IWW book and the free speech book are connected. Well, in some way, they are connected, because they're trying to look at different ways in which the government suppressed dissent. And different targets. The IWW was the priority target, but when they got done with the IWW, they moved on to the Socialist Party. And when they got done with the Socialist Party, they moved on to progressives. You know, that's one of the things that became clear to me. It's not just a cliche; it's the truth. It's once you start having these autocratic governments, one group goes, then the next group goes, then the next group goes. There's no real end to it, because after a while, anybody who says anything that's in any way critical of what you're doing, you've convinced yourself is obstructing the war effort, and you need to get rid of them. So I sort of looked at how that happened during World War I, and the Wobblies were the most successful radical group. They were immediate priority target. But then when they got done with them, they started moving on to groups that were nowhere near as radical, and yet they still felt, you know. The concrete example, in the first few months, you could write that the World War I, arose out of imperialist rivalries. You could write that, and they didn't like it, but they would tolerate it. By early 1918, that got you a conviction under the Espionage Act. That was sufficient proof that you were obstructing the war effort, because you said, and actually one of the points in the Espionage Act, it said you can't pass false information. So it's hard to believe, but it's true. The government would go into court and say, look, you're claiming that World War I arose out of imperialist rivalries. That's a lie, because Woodrow Wilson says we're fighting for democracy. That's it. Off to jail you go. So, yeah, that's sort of the context in which I started looking into all this, and yeah, I think there's important lessons to be learned there. That you can't parse free speech. Once you start parsing free speech, you're heading in a very dangerous direction. Everybody has the right to present a point of view, as long as they're not immediately and directly inciting violence. We're not going to like some of those points of views. That's life. But it's important to maintain those principles. And I think World War I shows what happens when you don't follow that principle. After a while, anybody can be subject to imprisonment.
Thank you. So, before Dan comes on, so would you say that it was worth, or it would have been worth the Wobblies to just, or any organization, to stand firm in their anti-war messaging rather than fudging it or trying to walk a weird line, because ultimately they still were killed, prosecuted, attacked, you know?
No, you're absolutely right. Fudging it didn't do any good. It just antagonized your own base, and it didn't satisfy the government because they always wanted more. What could they have done? That's one of the things that I've found in these documents that you'll see in the anthology. There was somebody on the General Executive Board, Richard Brazier was his name, and as the war geared up, he said, "Look, we're going to become a target of repression. We should oppose the war, and we're going to become a target of repression. Let's go underground. Let's move the headquarters to Mexico, and we'll start developing an underground system." Now, it's not going to be a panacea, but it would have been a smart move, because instead they just were sitting ducks, and the government just off they went. So yeah, I think that would have been a wise thing to do, and that's a tough thing to do because the WAPs were proud of being open, transparent, but at certain times when the level of repression becomes too high, really you don't. Your choice is jail or going underground. So better to go underground. And they would have been wise to do that. And he did actually make a concrete proposal. Haywood just sort of blew it off. I think it was a big mistake. Haywood, it's hard to understand, but Haywood actually had confidence in the judicial system. He thought if they got the right lawyers, they could get off. Don't ask me why he thought that, but he did. And he wound up in jail. But I think that was the real alternative, and yes, they should have. But halfway didn't do any good at all. If they were going to, if they were going to capitulate, they had to capitulate the whole way. But of course, then the rank and file would have been, screaming like crazy. So instead, they fuddled, and they didn't please anybody. That rarely does that kind of thing work. Take a clear position.
Right. I think the important value is truth. So if you're going to be a truth teller, you need to stick to truth. And if you can't openly speak to truth, then as you said, maybe you should find another way where you can speak truth until the time comes when you can speak your truth to the masses.
Right.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
I think it was hard for people in the United States to come to terms with the idea that it could become so repressive that you had to go underground. But that turned out to be the reality.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciated, what we have read. We'll continue reading of your history because, as you said, it's understudied. I'm not, a labor history expert, but and obviously I'm not new to thinking that the United States is capable of all these type of activities, but it still was very surprising to me, as you said, that, they kept the military in these certain towns for years to stop union organizing. I just didn't understand that the United States government had taken it that far to repress laborers for being anti-war, for just fighting for better conditions in mines. So.
Yeah, well, you're right. It's a hard thing to come to terms with. And this wasn't Donald Trump either. This wasn't a right-wing Republican. This was a moderately liberal Democrat who was very proud of being a progressive, actually. And he, did more to violate civil liberties probably than any other president in U.S. history. So, yeah. Hard to come to terms with, but it's the truth, right? So as you said, the important thing is to stick to the truth. That is what happened. And we should try and learn from it.
Excellent. Well, we have Dan waiting. I think we're going to bring Dan in, and Eric's going to take a little break at his leisure, and he'll come back in a little towards the end, and maybe we can have a little four-way discussion if there's time. So let's bring Dan in.
Okay.
Hey,
Thank you,
good
Eric.
afternoon. How you
Hi,
doing?
Dan.
Hello, good to see you.
Good to see you. How
Bye,
are
Eric.
you?
Good.
Bye, Eric. See you later.
How y'all doing?
Good,
We're
good.
doing good. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. I'm great.
Good.
Good. Glad to hear it.
So I couldn't see if, you were backstage or how long you were backstage, but I don't know if you, what you heard of that conversation with Eric, if there was something you wanted to pick up or a good...
Yeah, I didn't hear. I really didn't.
Okay,
I
okay.
just jumped off
fine.
another interview and onto this one. So
No worries.
No, that's totally fine.
Why don't we, since we sort of ended on suppression of labor, why why don't we go directly into your personal experience with sort of at the intersection of labor organizing and international law, some of the cases you've been involved in, some of the things you've seen and you've been privy to, which really, as bad as we really only started to touch on how bad the labor suppression in the United States was. You could go on a lot about that, but it's even worse abroad, I think. So we'll have you talk about that, and then we'll sort of move into your knowledge of the more contemporary relationship between the CIA and the AFL-CIO. Maybe we can touch on when it became the AFL-CIO, and then we'll see where we go from there.
Great. Sounds good. Well, so, I mean, the big issue I worked on as a lawyer for the steelworkers, where there was that intersection with international issues, was with Colombia, South America, a country that is very critical to U.S. foreign policy. It's probably the closest ally the U.S. has in South America. And yet it's a country that you hear very little about in the news. If people know anything about it, they know about drugs, coffee. But Colombia's had some of the worst human rights in the world. And the one thing that, the labor movement in the U.S. became aware of is that for years, Colombia has the worst case of anti-union violence in the world. More trade unionists are killed in Colombia every year than any country on earth. And that's been happening for decades now. Easily over 4,000 trade unionists have been killed in Colombia. And at the high water mark in the 2000s, after Plan Colombia was passed, the military aid program that Clinton came up with to provide billions of dollars in military assistance to Colombia, the numbers just shot through the roof, where you had, 200 to 300 unionists killed per year. And that's really when the labor movement of the U.S. stepped in and said, look, this is unacceptable. We shouldn't be giving military aid to a country that's killing union leaders. We shouldn't be giving them favorable trade preferences like the Colombia Free Trade Agreement, which the U.S. labor movement successfully held up for years based on its concern for the killing of trade unionists. So, and in the course of that work, I got involved with companies, suing companies who we alleged collaborated with Colombian military and paramilitary forces to have union leaders killed, which is has been a fairly typical thing. And again, continues to this day, where you have this real linkage between the paramilitary death squads and both domestic and international capital in Colombia.
It just reminds me of what Eric was talking, when he was speaking about the history of the Wobblies and the companies themselves hiring or allowing essentially death squads or, people to rough up the union members. Eric was just talking about rounding them up, putting them in these cable cars, shipping them off to the desert. So really a continuation of this is what you're saying by the companies themselves.
Yes, absolutely. And I did not catch his presentation, but he might have been referring to the Phelps Dodge strike, in which strikers famously, as you say, were stuffed into railway cars that were put in the desert and they were left for dead. In a very famous incident. And yes, I think there are a lot of connections between the companies in the U.S. using these thugs, these private contractors like the Pinkertons famously. Or actually, I remember growing up in Cincinnati, one of those firms was called Knuckles and Associates. and companies using military and paramilitary forces abroad. There's a real connection there. So in Colombia, for example, I mean, the most famous case, if I can talk about, and it's documented and corroborated, is the case of Chiquita Banana. So first of all, Chiquita Banana used to be the United Fruit Company, famously. And if you ever read 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, there's a banana massacre in that book. And in the book, which is a form of what do they call it? Magical realism. Yeah. Mm. What happens is there's this strike in this town by banana workers, and they're killed and loaded up on in trains, by the way, and shipped away, and the bodies are never seen again. And this was based on a real incident in 1928 in the town of Ciénaga, where United Fruit prevailed upon the military to do what Marquez documents in the book, the mass murder of these banana workers. And so, as history continues, United Fruit has continued to play this very treacherous role in Latin America in particular. It was the leading force behind the coup against Arbenz, Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954, in which a Democratic president, Arbenz, was overthrown in a coup, a U.S.-backed coup, again, largely at the behest of the United Fruit Company. And what followed was a series of military dictatorships that the U.S. also supported, who not only suppressed labor, but who killed around 200,000 Guatemalans. United Fruit, because of its reputation from those sorts of incidents, changed its name to the more, kind of warm and fuzzy Chiquita Brands International. And they moved their headquarters from Boston then to Cincinnati. What happened is there was a board member of Chiquita who learned that for years, this was in 2003, he learned that for years prior and up to that time, Chiquita had been giving money to paramilitary forces in Colombia. It turns out in toto about $1.7 million, and that they ran them 3,000 Kalashnikov rifles as well. And the board member was worried about his own legal liability once he learned of this, so he went to the Justice Department and told them that this was happening. What made it very significant was, at the time, the paramilitary group known as the AUC, which was the group they were paying, was a designated terrorist organization by the U.S. State Department. What that meant was any sort of material support to that type of group was criminally illegal. I mean, it could result in jail time. It'd be like supporting Al-Qaeda, right? And so he went to the Justice Department. Ultimately, what happened is Chiquita pled guilty to supporting the paramilitaries. And as a consequence, they were fined a grand total of $25 million, which they were allowed to pay over 5 years. And what makes the penalty even more, I guess, laughable, if not making you want to cry, is that the consequences of their support of these paramilitaries was really catastrophic. In fact, I met with the Attorney General for Colombia, a guy named Mario Iguaran, and he said that Chiquita had paid for blood. He said, Chiquita claimed they were paying for security. They claimed, we were just paying the paramilitaries like you pay the mafia. We're just paying them off so they'd leave us alone, right? And he said that was a lie. He said they were not paying for security, they were paying for blood. They were paying for the paramilitaries to subdue the Yoruba region of Colombia so Chiquita could grow bananas there. And in the process, these paramilitaries killed thousands of Colombians, literally thousands, mostly Afro-Colombians, by the way. And what he also said, this Iguaran, was that not only did the paramilitaries kill thousands of people as a direct consequence of this aid in that region, but they also, because of that support, became a dominant force in Colombia, throughout Colombia. And they remain dominant. Again, while Colombia is completely out of the news, there are still paramilitary death squads that are active in that country, engaging in massacres, killing union leaders, killing indigenous leaders, killing environmental leaders, killing Catholic priests. And again, the support that Chiquita gave to these forces allowed them to become a powerful force, including a powerful political force in Colombia. So both, really, the last three presidents of Colombia, Alvaro Uribe, the most notorious, Juan Manuel Santos, and the current president, Ivan Duque, they all have had a significant relationship with the paramilitaries. Uribe, who was very close to the U.S., he got the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Bush, and he also was invited to the Obama White House, right? He came out of Medellin, and he was very close and worked with the Medellin cartel, including with Pablo Escobar. And they helped give rise to his political career, in which he became president, and he was a powerful president for 8 years. And this was the high watermark of Plan Colombia. So during his tenure, the U.S. was giving $10 billion in total during his time in office to the military, while they knew, and again, you can read human rights reports on this, you can read a lot of accounts on this. They knew that the military was working hand in glove with the paramilitaries, sharing the weapons we gave them, sharing equipment with the paramilitaries, and even the soldiers during the day were paramilitaries at night. Everyone knew this. And during this time, you had some of the worst human rights record that Colombia's seen, really, since La Violencia in the 50s. And it should be noted, not only, were the paramilitaries carrying out massacres, the military we were funding were carrying out massacres. And so, as surfaced later, and as the military would admit to, it was engaged in something called the false positive scandal at this time. Again, when it's receiving all this money from the U.S., it was taking young men, civilians, people they knew who were civilians, killing them, dressing them up as guerrillas, putting weapons in their hands, and then claiming they had killed guerrillas. They would even announce, they would lure young men with the promise of jobs and say, hey, come to this job recruitment fair or whatever. And young people would go, and they'd be loaded up on buses, and they'd be shot and killed. And again, dressed up as guerrillas. The International Criminal Court has been investigating this. It's believed anywhere between 6,000 and 10,000 people were killed in this way. Now, and part of it was largely done to justify U.S. military aid, because they wanted to prove to the U.S. they were killing guerrillas. So they pretended to. It's just this incredible thing. And again, this got almost no press, right? Every time Hugo Chavez would fart or Nicolas Maduro would, drop a fork at the dinner table, it would be on the nightly news, right? But here they're killing thousands of people with U.S. tax dollars, and you don't hear boo. And it's continuing. It's gotten worse in the last few years. It got a little better. It's gotten worse, where you have, I think last year, something like 300 social leaders were killed. And again, there's just no news. 80 Catholic priests have been killed in Colombia since 1984, 2 bishops. And according to the Catholic Bishops' Conference, they were killed because they were advocating for the poor. Again, one might think someone would care about such matters. But there's nothing.
Yeah. If I could just, to your, talking about Colombia and the news and the relationship with the United States and no reporting about all of these human rights abuses. This past week, I don't know if you saw, but I saw 2 reports. I read one of them, I think it was in the New York Times, about Colombia deciding to allow Venezuelan migrants up to stay in Colombia, I think on a sort of like a 10-year visa type thing. But the article that I read was very interesting because, of course, no mention of what's going on in Colombia. And what they said about Venezuela is, I wish I could remember, but they said Colombia is graciously accepting all of these Venezuelans because Venezuela is a failed socialist state, is what they said. Or like they said they have failed socialist ideas or something like that. But they made it seem like, it's all Venezuela's fault. No mention of, what's been done to Venezuela by the United States. So, yeah, just to go along with what you're saying, we're not hearing human rights abuses in Colombia. And in fact, that article I read looked very favorably on Colombia because it said, oh, look how great Colombia is. They're taking all these Venezuelans. They're going to do this, and I just couldn't help but wonder the whole time, like, what is really going on here below the surface?
Yeah, no, it's an amazing thing. And again, I think the tale of these 2 countries, Colombia and Venezuela, is very instructive to the U.S. propaganda system, right? You have 2 South American countries, roughly the same size, right next door to each other. And the coverage that's given them could not be more different. For example, you never hear of the 6 million Colombians who live in Venezuela, who have fled Colombia over the years to flee violence and go to Venezuela. You don't hear about incredible economic deprivation in Colombia, a country that is not under U.S. sanctions and that, in fact, gets a lot of U.S. aid, right? So, for example, I give this example. Right across the Venezuelan border is an area known as La Guajira. In fact, La Guajira is a I believe it's a peninsula that it crosses Colombia into Venezuela, like it straddles it. And within La Guajira live the Wayu people. That's the largest indigenous tribe in Colombia, and they live in Venezuela too. So their territory straddles both countries. Well, on the Colombian side, and I visited La Guajira, I visited the Wayu people there. They're starving to death, and they're dying of thirst. Literally thousands of children have died due to starvation and lack of water. And so, the irony was when, what's his name? The guy from the UK, Richard Branson had this, he had this charity concert in Colombia on the Venezuelan border, allegedly to raise money for Venezuela, as part of a propaganda thing. He could have just given the money to the people right there, right? But we don't learn about those people. And so the thing with the Wayu as well that's fascinating and sad is the reason they're dying largely is because they had this river that ran through the territory and they got water from it. They were able to, water their crops from it. A mining company, an international mining company called Cerrejón, has blocked up the water with a dam and uses all the water for itself. So the river now is completely dry. You can stand right in the middle of it. It's bone dry. And so you have international company that is causing the death of all these people. Everyone knows it within Colombia. I mean, anyone who pays attention knows this is happening. And yet all you do is hear about the, deprivations in Venezuela. And it was interesting. I'll give another example, and I hope I'm not going too far afield, but I do find the U.S. propaganda system fascinating. So there's a guy named John Otis, who's a Latin American correspondent for NPR. And I pay attention whenever he's on, because frankly, to me, he sounds like a CIA mouthpiece. I don't know that he is a CIA asset, but if he's not, they owe him some money because he does a great job for them. But in any case, he did a story on the Wayu people in La Guajira in Colombia, and he talked about that they're starving and they don't have water, and that was okay. That's good that he said that, but he gave two reasons for this. He said the reason they're doing so bad is because of their backward culture, first of all. And then second of all, because at that point, because of sanctions, Venezuela was not allowing people to take goods into Colombia and sell them for, cut prices. So, and he never mentions the river or Cerrejón, right? So ultimately, these people are starving, and whose fault is it? Their own and Venezuela's, right? And so, this is how consent is manufactured. This is why people of good intention will believe we should overthrow the government in Venezuela and not know about, again, the horrible crimes that are being committed in Colombia and that have been for many, many decades, largely with U.S. support.
And sorry, if you could just clarify, if we could go back to the Chiquita, what exactly were the laborers trying to accomplish? Like, why did the paramilitaries ever get created in the first place? I mean, was it just outright, we got to, what was happening?
Well, sometimes, again, in the case of Chiquita, the paramilitaries will certainly target union organizers and leaders, right, for obvious reasons, to give the companies greater reign, over their business. But a lot of times what they do is simply kill people who are living there to get rid of them, right? Because they're somewhere that a company wants to grow bananas, or a company wants to mine stuff, right? Or a company wants to build stuff, and there's people inconveniently living there.
Yeah,
think they have a right to live there, and when they say boo, they're killed. I mean, this is, and by the way, Colombia has the most internally displaced people on earth, even greater than Syria, at 8 million out of a population of like 50 million, something like that. So that's a huge percentage. And these people have largely been displaced by companies who have coveted their land for, again, a host of things. Colombia is a very resource-rich country. It has emeralds, and it has gold, and it has oil. Now, of course, a huge commodity has clean water, at least in some places. And, of course, it has arable land, so this makes it very attractive to capital exploitation. And again, a lot of that takes the form of moving people off their land and sometimes killing them in the process.
All right. Well, that was very depressing.
Yeah, no,
But
it is depressing. Yeah,
it is the reality of the situation. I think, it's one of the themes of the show. It's like we don't want to look away from the truth. And, you can nitpick about Maduro and like what kind of leader he is. But it's just crazy the way these things get presented and who is, that the bad guy and who's the good guy in global politics. And it's just like this constant revolving door of whatever is most convenient for the United States. And the most frustrating thing about that, I think for me, is that liberals keep falling for this over and over again, especially recently.
I think they're the most prone to believe this stuff, which is depressing. I'll just give another example. If you saw the show Narcos, the Colombia segments, which are pretty good. The one thing they show, and this is true, this did happen, is that in the course of trying to go after Pablo Escobar in Medellin, the DEA and the CIA partnered with the drug cartel in Cali. So it wasn't about getting rid of drugs. It was just deciding who was going to benefit from them. So they sided with the Cali people. And in the show, they do talk about two key figures in the Cali cartel, Fidel and Carlos Castaño, the Castaño brothers. And they would come to create the AUC paramilitaries that now haunt Colombia. And so they were aided directly by the United States to do that. And this goes back to the 1960s when a guy named General William Yarborough, working for John F. Kennedy, came up with the idea of the paramilitaries. The U.S. has been helping create these death squads for a long time. They even did it earlier in the Philippines in the earlier part of the 20th century. Did it in Vietnam, did it in Iraq, did it in El Salvador pretty famously. But Colombia was one of the first modern testing grounds for the paramilitary phenomenon. And what Yarborough wanted, and again, he said this in his white paper, I mean, this is public knowledge, that he wanted a force that could carry out the dirty war against priests and peasants and union leaders without any, culpability of the military in a country like Colombia or the U.S. military. So it was essentially a way to contract out these crimes. And so the U.S. really is responsible in large part for this paramilitary phenomenon. And of course, U.S. companies have aided that process. There was also an interesting article, I think it was the Washington Post or New York Times, I'm forgetting which, but no, it was the Washington Post. They did an expose on the CIA's role in Colombia under Uribe and how the CIA really helped the Colombian military go after the FARC guerrillas, left-wing guerrillas, and helped to defeat them, which was what brought them to the negotiating table. The CIA provided a lot of intelligence to the Colombian military of where the FARC encampments were, provided them with smart bombs that they could use to target them, etc. Now, that wasn't a huge surprise, to people like me. We knew that the U.S. was going after the FARC. What was interesting in the article is they made a point to say, in kind of a throwaway line, is that the CIA was unconcerned about the paramilitaries. Even though the paramilitaries were a designated terrorist organization by the U.S., that they were helping in the war against the FARC, but they were basically like, well, we don't care about the paramilitaries, which was a very damning thing. And in fact, so then the New York Times had an interesting article after that, again, this incredible, once in a while, again, the press, if you read it enough, once in a while they have something interesting in it, though they tend not to connect all the dots. But they had this story on how one night in Colombia, the CIA helped get 40 paramilitary leaders out of the country, out of Bogota. And the reason they did it is because there was this Truth and Reconciliation Committee that had been set up that was encouraging both the FARC and paramilitaries to essentially talk about their crimes. And in return, they get like lighter sentences and that sort of thing. Well, Uribe, back to President Alvaro Uribe, became concerned that the paramilitaries were starting to talk about their connections with him. This was not good. So he went to the U.S. and said, hey, you got to help me here. So they took all the paramilitary leaders out. And they brought them to the U.S. Now, all of them were, for the most part, tried for drug-related crimes, but not at all for their human rights abuses, because they didn't want them to talk about those because that might connect them with Uribe. And what this New York Times article talked about was that they all got light sentences as well up here, and some were even given political asylum after they left prison. And some of these people are the worst people you've ever heard of. One guy they called him the drill because he was a rapist, and he mostly preferred to rape children. And he was given a deal here in the U.S., this paramilitary. It's incredible, right? Now, again, it was good. It was in the New York Times. There was one article, and then it was done. You never heard of it again. You don't hear about it on NPR. This should have been a scandal, right? When we're keeping poor families from Mexico from coming here and giving, again, asylum to these murderers, which is what they are. But it shows, again, the connection that the U.S. has with these death squads.
Let me just jump in here since we're on a bit of a tight schedule. Why don't we do the AFL-CIO part in the very end? And since we're talking about manufacturing consent and how these things play out and how people get impressions, and you mentioned how humanitarian organizations are involved specifically with Venezuela, and how these things, like, I don't know which one it was, but I know there was a story about they went there with supposed humanitarian aid, and Venezuela government, being suspicious of this, turned it away. And then this is, of course, then used to say, oh, they're refusing international humanitarian aid. And there's more to that story, too. I think that particular convoy of aid may have also been full of not aid. I'm not sure about that. But the point I'm making is that let's talk a little bit about Human Rights Watch and maybe Amnesty if we have time, and how it's important. I don't want to say that they don't ever speak the truth or do good work, but that it's very important to understand how they are operating in conjunction to a large part with Western powers and doing this manufacturing of consent that we're talking about.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. So in terms of this aid, I think it is worth talking about because this was this aid convoy, for lack of a better word. This was direct aid from the United States, I believe the USAID. And this was being done, I believe it was January of 2019. This is just when the U.S. had recognized this Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela. And so they set up this, what they clearly wanted was a conflict at the border that would have justified a U.S. military invasion. So they sent or tried to send these semis full of aid into Venezuela. And the interesting thing about that was that at least one or two of the trucks were set on fire. And immediately the mainstream press said, look, this shows how evil this Nicolas Maduro is. He had his people set these things on fire. This is food, you know. His people are starving. He's setting these things on fire. And this was based on CNN reportage at the scene. Meanwhile, Max Blumenthal from the Gray Zone was also there, and he videotaped what happened, and it clearly showed that they were set on fire on the Colombian side, not by Venezuelans. They were set on fire by Colombians. And at first, no one picked up Blumenthal's report. They were all relied on the CNN people who claimed they saw something they couldn't have seen, and that was that somehow they were set on fire from the Venezuelan side. So, again, I remember listening to NPR that weekend, and again, they were wringing their hands about how evil Maduro was and the show how evil he was. Finally, a few weeks later, the New York Times finally mentioned Blumenthal's video, said, you know, okay, we all said it was Maduro. Looks like it was the Colombians who did it. Let's move on. And then again, it was forgotten. But within those few weeks, and this happens all the time, so the record is never really set well by anyone. Again, NPR didn't report on the New York Times correction, right? A lot of places didn't. But even if someone read the Times piece, what happens is, the stink from the first story has been in your nostrils for 3 weeks. And you now think Maduro's this monster. You may not even remember why, but it's in the back of your head, that he did this monstrous act. So that was an interesting case. And we see this all the time. Now, in terms of, the human rights groups, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, I mean, my beef with them is that these are Western-centered organizations that get all their money from the West, that cater to, the Beltway for money and also for legitimacy. And so it skews how they report on things and what they report on, what they focus on. And again, that's really how the media and other manipulation works. It's what you talk about, how you talk about it, but also what you don't talk about. And we see time and again that they have played a role in helping pave the way for military intervention. The real classic case was Libya, where they reported on lies as fact, at least initially. They reported that Gaddafi was giving Viagra to his troops to carry out mass rapes, and they claimed that Gaddafi was using black mercenaries, importing them to fight his own people. Those turned out not to be true. And later, Amnesty International did say they weren't true, but by the time they did, the war had already begun. It was too late. It was finished, right? And again, the other thing they're criticized for is that as a rule, so you have, two major forms of war crimes that are, regulated and by international law. One is what they call, your human rights crimes, which is essentially a state carrying out abuses against people, or people being abused, their human rights abuses carried out in the process of a war, okay? And that's what they focus on. What they have made it clear is they do not talk about or take a position on what is actually considered the greater crime, and that is the initiation of a war of aggression, right? So it's not just a crime to do bad things when you're in the process of a war. The main crime is that you've started an aggressive war. They don't take a position on that. They're honest about that. They say, well, when the U.S. and Iraq end up going to war, we just tell them basically to be nice to each other. And this is absurd, right? Because when any country engages in war, it will torture, it will rape, it will, all these evils that these human rights groups report on, they flow from the first major crime, which is the war itself. But also when you just tell, and they really do, they tell the Iraqis in the U.S. to play nice and abide by the Geneva Conventions when a war breaks out, it also ignores the fact that you have a victim and a victimizer. And people say it's like telling, a person being raped, be gentle on your rapist. It really is, right? Iraq they were attacked. They didn't do anything. And they're told, oh, well, behave yourself as they're getting bombed. So there's a very strange aspect to all this that frankly has turned me off a lot on this whole international human rights industry, because it really doesn't take into account the reality of imperial domination. Let's put it that way. Those are my 2 cents anyway.
Excellent. Well, I know you got to run in a little under 15 minutes, but I was listening to one of your other podcasts. I think it was on Historically, and they raised the topic of the AFL-CIO, which is not something I don't know if you've done a deep dive or you're an expert, but you definitely had some interesting things to say. So if you just want to briefly touch on that, and maybe a little bit of the context of why American laborers in the AFL-CIO would have been okay with this or susceptible. Why did they take the side of the CIA?
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating and shameful history. It begins after World War II. So first of all, the CIO unions, the industrial unions, are largely led and created by communists, by the Communist Party of the United States. After World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, the Truman administration decides that this is unpalatable and tells the labor groups to purge themselves of their communists. They have to sign an anti-communist pledge, in fact. And they do that in large part. Some unions didn't. The UE, for example, which is very small now, refused. But most of the labor movement went along with this. But in addition to this, the greater thing that happened was that the labor leadership, and I want to say the leadership because the rank and file largely didn't know about this, were never told about it, and it was all kept secret to the extent they could keep it secret. But the leadership of the AFL-CIO, when the CIO and AFL merged, I forget exactly when that was, late 40s, early 50s, they decided to partner with the U.S. State Department and the CIA to fight the Cold War around the world. And why they did that is for a few reasons. One, it was ideological. Again, the communists had been purged, and so the anti-communists naturally came to the fore and were the leaders. So they ideologically were opposed to communism and socialism. But in addition to this, what one has to understand is after World War II, the U.S. was the only industrialized country in the world who was barely affected by the war, right? Their industries weren't destroyed. Their cities weren't destroyed. After the war, the U.S., with 5% of the world's population, controlled 50% of its resources. 50. And so the labor leaders decided to make a deal with the capitalists in this country. Hey, we got 50% of the fucking world's resources, if I can say that on public. Let's just, we'll divvy it up and give us good wages and good jobs, and we're with you, man. And we'll go fight them commies. Okay, so a deal was struck. And so the labor movement worked with the CIA in overthrowing Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954. They worked with the CIA to overthrow Allende in Chile in 1973, paid the Teamsters there to go on strike to undermine Allende. They helped support the dictatorship in the Philippines and South Korea. The U.S. labor movement for years, their international arm was an arm of U.S. foreign policy, openly. And in fact, to such an extent that when the CIA, after the Frank Church Commission hearings in the 70s, exposed a lot of their crimes, and it was decided the CIA should back off a bit from its covert ops, Ronald Reagan created the National Endowment for Democracy to take over a lot of that work, a lot of the coup operations that the CIA had been involved in. And the NED, in turn, had only three organizations that it worked through. The International Democratic Institute, right, which is the international wing of the Democratic Party, the International Republican Institute, and the AFL-CIO. And so this showed exactly what this relationship was. Now, obviously, I'm not old enough to remember Chile in 73 or Arbenz in 54, but I was around when there was the coup against Chavez in 2002. 2002, right? Yeah. And I happen to know that the AFL was openly supporting the coup. A guy named Rhett Dumit, who was their Andean region guy, he still is, by the way, he actually helped put together the coalition of Fed Commerce, which was the Venezuelan Chamber of Commerce, and the CTV Union of Venezuela, put them together, which became a big force in the coup a few months later. And I knew guys who were in Caracas working for the AFL, handing out anti-Chavez literature and that sort of thing. And they were giving thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars to anti-Chavez unions in Venezuela at the time, who became instrumental in the coup. This all came out, by the way, in the New York Times. Again, they did an expose, and they said, okay, the NED, after the coup failed, right? It failed in about 2.5 days. The New York Times, who supported the coup, right, said this was a democracy breaking out. After it failed, it had to do a little mea culpa or whatever, as it always does. And it did a story on how the AFL was giving all this money from the NED, channeling it from the NED to these coup groups. And I knew everyone involved at the AFL because I was doing my work in Colombia at the time. So I knew Stan Gasic, who was head of international affairs at the time for the AFL. I knew Rhett Dumit. So they're all hitting the panic button. We're all getting these messages saying, "Oh, we didn't do it," and but they did it. They clearly did it. And in fact, Gasic, again, nice guy and all, he claimed that the money was going for things that ultimately was proven didn't go for. So this was a huge embarrassment, and frankly, the Cold War had ended, as we know, over a decade before. The AFL took a while to figure that out, And I don't, at the present, so I don't work for the steelworkers anymore. I don't know the level of that engagement. What I do know is they continue to get money from the NED. They continue to be one of the three pillars of the NED. And I imagine, therefore, that they carry out some of that work. Now, whether it's as overt as they had, again, during the Cold War and soon thereafter, I don't know. But it's been unfortunate. And the thing is, again, they don't use much of their own money to do it. They get it from the NED. They're very secretive about what they do. They call themselves now the Solidarity Center, okay? Which I don't know what to say about that. There's not much solidarity involved. But if you go to their website, they have these little paragraphs on what they do in these countries. They tell you nothing. You have to do some digging, or you have to know people who are involved. The point being that, rank and file people, by and large, didn't know this was happening. So they're not responsible for that. And they didn't ask their leaders to do this. They did it. The leaders did it because they wanted to. And they did it, again, because they wanted access to power in Washington. And again, because they, up to a point, felt like they had a nice gig in the U.S. capitalist system. That, their workers were getting paid well. They were, unions were favored, at least for a while after World War II. And again, like the AFL being slow on the uptake of the Cold War ending, they were slow on the uptake that their deal had ended sometime probably in the 70s. That the capitalists had decided they didn't want unions anymore. They weren't going to be paying good wages anymore. They didn't need them. And yet the labor movement, by and large, kept up its part of the bargain in continuing to engage in these international adventures. I'll actually tell you, too, again, you just learn stuff by being around. I worked for the Steelworkers for 26 years. One of my bosses was a guy named George Becker. He was president for a time, and he knew my politics, and he knew all my interest in Latin America. I was like the one kind of, token commie in the union. As one of my other commie friends says, yeah, they can't have more than one or you got a club. So, but they're happy to have one. So he once told me on an elevator, he told me that he was involved in the coup against Arbenz in 54. And
it's always on an elevator, isn't it?
It's always on an elevator. It was before they had security cameras in elevators. But anyway, so you learn some stuff. But that didn't surprise me. His son actually told me that when they were kids, they thought their dad was a spy. And I guess in a sense he was, really. And the AFL-CIO had a lot of those spies, and some regretted what they did. I had another guy, Ray McDonald, I knew. He was in Vietnam when Saigon fell, and he had been involved in operations in Vietnam, against the left there. And it's a fascinating story. It all hasn't been written because, unlike the U.S. government, there's no FOIA requirement for the AFL-CIO. You can't compel them to give up information. So a lot of the information has kind of been pieced together over time. There's a guy named Kim Skypes. I think he's at Purdue. He's written a lot on this. There's stuff out there, but Phil Agee, who was in the CIA, when he wrote his book, The Company, he talks about the labor movement too. But again, you kind of have to find it out by hook or by crook, because to the extent it was documented, no one's getting those documents. So with that, I have to leave. I'm actually doing food delivery today. That's my charitable work. So I got to get some food to people. But I thank you for having me, and I enjoyed it, and I'd love to come back if you will endure me.
Of course, of course. Thank you so much, Dan. We really appreciate all of your work and knowledge and sharing it with us. So thank you, and have fun delivering food.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Dan. Bye,
Take
Dan.
care. Okay, bye-bye.
Well, we welcome back Eric Chester for a little while at the end of this discussion. I guess you caught the end of that there, Eric. I don't know. What did you think about that? Do you agree with most of that, or did you have issues with Dan?
Disagreements with him, but you expect that. Just on the historical part, while the AFL-CIO is not covered by FOIA, you better believe there are all kinds of documents in the CIA archives, and they will eventually come out.
Right.
There would be higher officials above the CIA that would be involved in it. So one of the things I've learned is you're surprised how many copies of highly sensitive documents there are. Everybody wants a copy, and if say there are 10 and 9 get destroyed, you got to find the 10th. So I think you could actually find stuff on the AFL-CIO. I guess that's one thing. Two, just to correct the historical record, CIO unions were organized by CPers. They were also organized by Socialist Party people and by radicals of various persuasions. My father used to work for the auto workers, which at one time was the most important CIO union. And it was actually organized by Socialist Party people and Communist Party people who for a while were in a coalition, then they fell out. But anyway, it's a lot more complicated history than that. And actually, just to be clear, the Communist Party in the 1930s was following a popular front policy, so they actually supported Roosevelt. They were supporting the Democratic Party. Socialist Party was to the left of the Communist Party because it was critical of the Democratic Party. That's just a historical note. This thing about human rights and countries that oppose the United States, it's a really complicated issue. But personally, I wouldn't want to try and defend the Gaddafi regime. The two particular examples I gave seem to me to be ridiculous and irrelevant. It was an extremely undemocratic society, Gaddafi's. All kinds of unpleasantness going on, which is not in the least way to justify the West intervening, and they made it even worse. Hard to believe, but they made it even worse. Now you have instead of one warlord, you got multiple warlords, a mess. So not in any way to justify it. Anyway, the U.S. has no business in Libya. Still, I wouldn't want to defend Gaddafi's record on human rights. It was awful. And I guess I'm an absolutist, not just about free speech. I'm an absolutist about human rights. I want every country to follow basic human rights. And I actually don't think there's any excuse for torturing people, no matter what the situation is. For one thing, you don't get good intelligence that way. But beyond that, it's degrading to everybody involved. It's wrong. That I have to say this seems rather weird, but I will. So I don't care really whether it's Gaddafi who's torturing people or the United States waterboarding people or Stalin. The list goes on, or Hitler, of course. Bad. Let's not defend it. As lefties, let's not defend it. That's how the CP wound up discrediting the left for a great deal of time by trying to justify what was going on in Stalin's Russia. So I don't see any reason to do that. That's in no way Dan said he wasn't around for Vietnam. I was around for Vietnam. I protested the United States involvement in Vietnam, but I didn't defend the Vietnamese government, which was undemocratic. And it was no surprise to me that when they took over South Vietnam, it was undemocratic as well. No reason to do that. There's no, the fact that you're opposing U.S. intervention doesn't mean that you have to support the other side. You can take a position opposing U.S. imperialism and calling for democracy and human rights everywhere, including Vietnam. I don't see the inconsistency there. It's quite on the contrary. I have to point out, though, that in the 60s, that was a minority position. Most people in the anti-war movement did try and justify what was going on the Vietnamese government side. Oh, that's life. I've often found that I'm in the left, in a minority even within the left, so you get used to it after a while. I think looking back and seeing what's happened in Vietnam, after all the wailing and moaning the U.S. government did about how they couldn't lose Vietnam, they lost Vietnam, and now they're making deals with Vietnam.
Well,
textile factories are blooming in Vietnam. Low wages are being paid in Vietnam. There's no real unions in Vietnam. Hey, the U.S. can live with that, right? The U.S. corporation not only can live with it, they love it. So I don't know. Let's be for democracy everywhere. Let's oppose human rights abuses everywhere, and let's oppose U.S. imperialism.
Well, this is, I think perfect segue into free speech, because this is exactly why free speech is so important. I mean, because what you're talking about is the nuance of all of it. If you just hear somebody say, okay, America shouldn't intervene in Libya or whatever, then you might think one thing about that person, but that doesn't mean necessarily that they would agree with Gaddafi. As you said, I said probably most leaders of countries have a long human, rights abuses rap sheet. But it's hard in conversations to pick apart that nuance. But again, why free speech is so important, and to have platforms where we can have longer discussions about the nuance.
Can I just
So,
jump into and say,
yeah.
you know, I think everything's on a case by case basis. Just sort of disclaimer: I come from a sort of radical anarchist tradition, which a lot of people, I don't necessarily identify as an anarchist anymore. I'm sort of open to a lot of different left ideas. A lot of people might not know what that means, but I'm sure Eric knows, the history behind that, and what the significance to this conversation being that I'm very skeptical of even left governments. And a lot of communists, further leftists, get very frustrated with anarchists because they don't cooperate with certain left projects. And I'm interested in these conversations. But things are on a case by case basis, first of all. And I think, Dan and us might disagree more on, like, say, Maduro. I don't think that Dan is meaning to defend Gaddafi in any way. And what we talked about in our first episode of the series about, I was speaking about, I want to know, this is a case by case basis. So I want to learn these things and figure these things out. And one of the problems doing that is you can't trust necessarily what the IRC says, or what Human Rights Watch says, or what Amnesty says. And even if those things were relatively inconsequential, the fact that they got them wrong is problematic. And, I want to be able to trust the institutions that I'm looking to help me understand what's going on the ground in areas where there's potential for conflict or regime change. So with that said, I think that sums it up.
That's a broader question you're raising, though, that goes well beyond Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. How do you find reliable information on highly controversial issues where there are all kinds of covert operations going on by different governments to distort the truth? Not an easy question to answer, right? I don't think there's any simple answer to that. But just have to dig around and have a little bit of skepticism towards any given source. Having said that, the evidence on Gaddafi is overwhelming. I mean, really overwhelming. They found all kinds of documents when they actually, occupied Tripoli that showed what had gone on. So yeah, that one, I don't think there really is a whole lot of doubt about what was going on under Gaddafi. And the case by case, yeah, you want to learn case by case what's going on, because every country is different, of course. But basic rules follow, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
There's never an excuse for torturing people. It's inexcusable. There's never an excuse for lining up people and shooting them unless you have some overwhelming reason, right? Not just because they disagree with you. These are pretty absolute rules. And unfortunately, Aaron, you're right. All too many governments have shown that they're willing to violate those rules, including the United States, of course, but other countries as well. I mean, Britain's role in its empire is appalling. You read what they did to maintain their empire. It wasn't sweet. Brutal occupation. And of course, always justified not only in the usual way, but these people were inferior. Blacks were inferior. So therefore, it didn't really matter if you tortured and killed them. And that's really sick when you think about it. But that's what happened. And furthermore, it's hard to find, they hide all this stuff because after a while they're embarrassed by it. So then they try and hide it. And it's hard to find the documents, but you got to keep looking around because they are probably documents somewhere out there that show exactly what happened in these circumstances. And it's up to us to uncover those documents. Oh.
I was wondering if you just had any advice for folks looking to get into archives, to get their hands dirty, to kind of get like actual real world practice with history and trying to understand these concepts.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, that one thing that's happened with the pandemic is they've closed the archives. How convenient.
Yeah. When people have all this time to look
Protests
stuff
aren't
up.
allowed,
Yeah.
not allowed to go on the streets. That's convenient. Archives are closed. That's convenient. Awfully convenient. But in any case, when they finally open up the archives, I think I said that historical research is you learn by doing. I don't think there's any textbook that's going to really tell you. You have to figure out a particular topic and start working at it and see where it leads and what kind of documents, what's the government agencies that are involved, and just I wish I could give you some easy formula, but I don't know what it is. So just got to keep working at it and keep banging your head against it. But as I said before, you'd be surprised how many times there's a copy somewhere of a document. The IWW trial transcript, right? For years, IWW historians, and there are quite a few of them, could not find a complete transcript of the Chicago trial. And I just kept digging around, and
You got it.
by accident I got it. But that's it. You got to keep working at it, and you try and keep in mind what is it you're looking for. That's an important part. What is it you're looking for, and then just keep going away at it. Don't get discouraged. It's likely to be out there.
Do you have to be, you have credentials to do this? I mean, could anybody just go into an archive? Anybody can? Wow, okay.
Anybody can do it. Anyway, I'm not trained as a historian. I'm trained as an economist, so I don't have the PhD in history. So. No, it's open. And what you find is a lot of people in the archives are looking for records of soldiers and their family, that kind of stuff. And then there are a few people who I think are being paid by some government to copy documents. But there are a few of us who are actually there trying to figure out what happened in the past. And yeah, we just keep at it.
Well, do you want to talk a little more about the free speech book or anything else on the Wobblies or anything you want to wrap up? I mean, we didn't really touch on Debs at all.
I'm worn out.
Fair enough. We really want to thank you. You've been a real trooper. I mean, this is like 4 hours of interview you've done at this point. So we really do appreciate you coming on. You're a wealth of information. Yeah. And we really encourage everybody to check out all of your books. It's like 7 or 8 now, I think you have, right?
7, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
I'm working on the 8th.
Excellent. Wow. What is the 8th on again?
Well, it's actually going to be the 3rd in a trilogy of suppression of dissent during World War I. This one is about progressives. Okay. How the United States government began targeting progressives and social democrats as they moved further and further from their primary target of radicals. And that's what this one's going to be about.
Great. Well, we're pretty tired too, I think. So we're going to take a nice break and enjoy the rest of the day. Okay. Thanks so much for coming on, Eric.
Thank you so much, Eric, and for all the work you've done.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Bye now.
Bye, everybody.